Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am delighted to introduce my guest today, Chrissi Kelly, who is the founder of UK charity AbScent, which supports those with smell loss or parosmia, I think if that's the correct pronunciation.
Yes.
So this is a really interesting topic that I'm looking forward to getting into. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I'm delighted to have you here. So to start with, would you just introduce yourself a little bit and I guess what it is that you do?
My name is Chrissi Kelly and I'm the founder of AbScent. We got our charitable status in May of 2019, so well in time for the pandemic. The seed for that charity began with a Facebook group back in 2015. And I started that after I lost my own sense of smell in 2012. So I had smell loss in 2012 and then sort of looked around for ways to help myself. I discovered something called smell training. And then in 2015, I started a small Facebook group for smell training. And that grew and grew. And in 2016, I started to make it official. So we were all ready to go in May of 2019 with a website and the Sniff smell training app and a questionnaire that we had embedded in our website. So there we were, just as the pandemic was just getting going. So it's been quite a ride since then. We started back when the pandemic was just getting going in February of 2020, we had 1,500 members, and now we have something like 85,000. So we've grown rather a lot, just like the many people who now find themselves with long COVID. So
yeah, that is a huge number, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I was thinking about this earlier, and until it became kind of a thing with COVID, I had never realized it was actually possible to lose your sense of taste and smell. But you were obviously happened to you well before COVID, and your charity was actually set up and running before COVID, wasn't it?
That's right. And of course, there was at that time, before the pandemic, there was, as you say, very little awareness about smell. It's the disregarded sense. It just doesn't get the recognition that it deserves as a bellwether for human health, for instance. Yeah, and just getting going with explaining to people how important it is to give credence to your sense of smell, to watch what's happening, and, to help us understand what's going on. There are, of course, many ways to lose the sense of smell, and a virus is just one of them. Probably the largest group of people with smell loss have got some sort of nasal disease, and that would include things like polyps. And then also we have people who are allergic, have allergies, seasonal allergies. That can be a problem. Head injury, TBI, where there is a coup contre coup blow to the head, which makes the brain wobble and then severs the nerves. So those are some common ways to lose your sense of smell. But I will say that, in the early days of the Facebook group, we would have people that would join us, who would say, oh, I lost my sense of smell 3 years ago. I didn't even know it had a name. And one of the first things that made me realize just how important smell was going to be with COVID was when I was out walking my dogs. This was in March, already at the end of March 2020. And a neighbor of mine stopped me and said, you run a charity, don't you, for people who have anosmia? And I thought, wow, when members of the public know a word like that, then you know that the word's getting out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This, raising awareness of all sorts of things that, they existed before COVID and long COVID, but I guess maybe not quite in the same numbers. So I asked this question before we started recording, actually, and you said to me, maybe you should ask that one while we're actually recording. So taste and smell. Is it possible to lose one without the other? I mean, they're linked, but how linked are they, and what are we talking about here? Are we talking about both?
So, two answers to that question, because there are two common uses of the word taste. So let me explain both of them to you and how they work together. So we have a sense of smell, and that sense of smell comes from the olfactory nerve that's in our nose. That's easy to understand. We also have gustation, and gustation is served by a nerve that serves the mouth. And that means that the tongue and the inside of the mouth detect salty, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami through receptors. And it's important to remember that those receptors are activated by things that are soluble in liquids, that is to say, saliva. So that's gustation. Now, colloquially, we call that taste. I like to call it true taste, just to remind people that we're talking about salty, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami. The problem arises when we start using the words taste and flavor interchangeably. Now, flavor would be described as the brain putting together information from the olfactory nerve and the gustatory nerve. In other words, what you experience inside your mouth, salty, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami, and a smell. And when you swallow and the muscles in your throat constrict to send the food down, they also pump a little bit of air up that goes up through the retronasal passageway, as it's called, up to the place high in the olfactory cleft where the olfactory epithelium is and where it can work its magic by picking up volatile molecules on olfactory receptors. So that experience of flavor, which is the coming together of olfaction and gustation, smell and true taste, that gives you that moment, that wonderful moment when you realize it's a beautifully ripe strawberry. Now, because that action happens in the mouth, we confuse flavor and taste. So when you're in a restaurant and you say, oh, this dinner is delicious and it's got really good taste, this tastes fabulous, you're not saying it has fabulous qualities of salty, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami. You're saying, wow, the whole experience is just wonderful. And so there is therefore a confusion about the word taste and smell. If you ask me about whether or not COVID affects olfaction and gustation, the answer to both of those questions is yes. We know that in the earlier cases of in the beginning of the pandemic, there seemed to be a lot more reported loss of gustation, and you may have seen clips on YouTube of people eating mouthfuls of the hottest imaginable chili peppers. That was explaining, or that was demonstrating, that there was also impairment of the trigeminal nerve. And the trigeminal nerve is the so-called pain sensor. That's the one that alerts you, for instance, when you eat chili, when you breathe in ammonia, if you taste ginger, the warming sensation of that, peppercorns, the tingling sensation, menthol, if you have a Vicks vapor rub. So that's a sort of third channel of a way for us to experience food. And that also was showing impairment with COVID. So you might have seen people on YouTube eating hot chili peppers. You might have seen people drinking straight vinegar and not minding. So there were impairments to all three of these nerves. And that now we see much less of that than we did. So, as we all know, the virus is mutating and evolving. And it just may be, and we don't really have all the evidence in yet, but it may well be that gustation and trigeminal function are less affected by COVID now than it used to be.
That is absolutely fascinating. I'd not realized how many different nerves and different bits were involved in what to me until now would have seemed one very simple thing.
Right.
It just tastes, but it doesn't just taste. It's a lot more complicated than that.
It's a whole experience. That's right.
That's actually blown my mind a little bit.
Next time you eat a hot curry, think about that.
I'm just trying to work my head around this. So would it be possible to lose one without the other?
I would say in general, not. I would say, first and foremost, we have olfactory loss. And then sometimes there's gustatory loss and trigeminal impairment. So, like I said, we saw a lot more of all three together in the beginning, but now most people mention olfactory loss, and occasionally they'll talk about salty and sweet, sweet, or they might say everything tastes salty, or I can't taste sweet. But, we have so little, we don't engage with the gustatory sense. We don't sort of spend a lot of time thinking about whether things taste sweet or salty. So, while there's very little known about the sense of smell, or not very little, but relatively little compared to vision and hearing, gustatory, that's even less well known. So, a lot of research is going on about that now. And, we'll find out more in the future. But it can be really difficult, even for people who know about all these things. I mean, I've had colleagues who have lost their sense of smell and their sense of true taste, who say, yes, but it's really hard to describe. I just don't know how to describe it. And that's, of course, something that we hear in our patient groups all the time, the frustration of not being able to describe what's happening to them. And, that this is in most cultures, there are not very many good words to describe smell. We're always saying things like, well, it smells like an orange. But I mean, aside from a couple of words like fragrant and musty, we don't really have that many words to describe the character of smells. So there are problems in communicating what the problem is. And we talk about that a lot also in the patient groups, frustration with that.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. Yeah, I mean, I've noticed it kind of across the board with my symptoms with long COVID, actually, that it is quite difficult to describe something that is new to you, that you've never really experienced before. And you can tell that there's something wrong, but you can't often quite describe what it is or what it feels like unless you hear somebody else describe it. And you go, oh, yeah, that's what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
But often it takes that, doesn't it? I sort of describe feelings as weird somehow because I just can't quite put my finger on what it is.
And of course, that is the value of peer support. That's why it's so vital that people who are experiencing this new thing can get together, talk about it, and kind of lay it all out on the table with a lot of Post-it notes, like what are we actually seeing here? And let everyone have their say. And yeah, that's just a really, really important aspect of getting to grips with something new like this.
Yeah, definitely. And you touched on it, I think, a second ago. You were talking about changes in taste and smell as well as loss, because I've definitely noticed on sort of support groups where people have said, oh, everything tastes horrible. I'm smelling cigarette smoke, even though there's nobody who's smoking, things like that.
What you've described are called qualitative changes to the sense of smell. So just to clarify, when we talk about smell impairments, we can talk about a quantitative loss, that is to say, just an overall diminishment of the sense of smell, or we can talk about a qualitative change. So that means that you smell a cup of coffee, and instead of smelling like the lovely beverage that you like to have every day, it smells like sewage. Now, within the qualitative changes, there are two that are described, and a third, which I will describe to you a little bit, which is something that we have come up with in our own research. So the two widely recognized qualitative changes are parosmia. That's where things start to smell mostly unpleasant, although very, very rarely you'll have someone who describes it as being a pleasant kind of sensation. But mostly it's disgusting, and that is sometimes these smells provoke such profound disgust that people can't eat. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit later, because that's really important for long COVID. The second qualitative change that is recognized is called phantosmia. And unlike parosmia, which is triggered by a thing that you would have on the table in front of you, phantosmia is something that happens without a trigger. So I think you could probably say it's a bit like tinnitus, in that, with tinnitus, you hear a noise, but it's coming from inside your head. It's not happening in the environment around you. So phantosmia is untriggered, parosmia is triggered. Now, something that we noticed in our patient groups, and we were noticing this actually long before COVID, is that people have something that we call in our group a smell lock. And what happens is you would smell something, and typically that would be something like laundry detergent or lemon scented washing up liquid, something like that. And then you get that smell in your nose, and then you can't stop smelling it. You smell it for all day, or maybe a couple of days. And what you can see happening is you start with a triggered response. In other words, you smell the laundry detergent and you think, ugh, that smells terrible. And then over a period of time, it becomes a perception that is untriggered. So it starts triggered, and then it goes on to become untriggered. And then that makes it neither parosmia nor phantosmia. And so Simon Gain, who is a trustee of AbScent and a rhinologist and very experienced in this field, he has called that olfactory perseveration, meaning that it's a reaction, perception that persists over time. That's what perseveration is. So yes, there are a number of kind of weird ways that you experience smell if you've got qualitative changes. We do suspect that people who have parosmia are experiencing an aberrant regeneration of the nerves. That is to say, the nerves are trying to regenerate, but they're just not doing a very good job yet. They haven't, if you imagine in the telephone exchange, you tear out all of the lines, and then you're trying to stuff them back into random holes, and then sometimes you make bad connections. And we think that's what's happening. There is also, if you look at the statistics, people who experience parosmia have slightly better outcomes than people who only experience hyposmia. But that doesn't mean that people who have hyposmia will not recover. It just means that their recovery is happening in a more organized way, more slowly.
Right. And I guess that's where this idea of patience comes in, that we're all so bad at.
They call it patience for a reason. I wanted to go back to this, talking about parosmia and the disgust over food and recovery from long COVID, because that can be really, really important thing. And anyone who's listening to this program who's experiencing parosmia and long COVID needs to keep an eye open to this. If you're recovering, you need good nutrition. And with parosmia, so many foods are just off the table. And that includes high protein foods, because these foods often contain the aroma compounds that are most noxious to people with parosmia. So they end up by excluding protein from their diet, and all kinds of vegetables and fruits are also eliminated, and it leaves them with a very reduced selection of foods that they can use. And many of them are more bland carbohydrate foods that don't deliver much in the way of vitamins and minerals. So if anybody is experiencing that, we recommend meal replacement drinks. And I'd also like to say, do be aware, and this is not the same as the kind of protein shakes that you would buy in a health food store for people that are weight training, for instance. That's not the same thing, and you want to avoid those. That's too much protein without all the other things that go with it. So if you do need to fall back on meal replacement drinks, make sure that you get the kind that are recommended at the pharmacy, for instance, the kind of things that you might give to someone who was recovering from surgery on their mouth and meant that they couldn't swallow food. It's got to be a more complete kind of drink. So do take that up with a pharmacist who will be able to help you get the right kind of meal replacement drink.
Yeah, that's a really good idea, actually, because it's a way of getting in all of your food groups and the benefits from them,
Yep.
but without having to put the food on the plate in the same way, I guess, which I guess is potentially triggering.
And there are a number of meal replacement drinks that you can buy dry that you mix up as an example. And there are lots of others, but there's one called Huel, Huel. I think Huel is a good idea because it's unflavored. And for many people, the artificial flavoring of chocolate and strawberry and banana and that kind of thing is just too disgusting. But with unflavored Huel, you can mix that up with oat milk or regular dairy milk if you are worried about losing a lot of weight, so full fat milk. And then you can add spices to it that might make it more palatable for you. A lot of people, even people who have bad parosmia, say that they enjoy cinnamon. So a couple of big spoonfuls of cinnamon in there to make sure that you experience something can be a good thing. So, people should experiment with that if that helps them. It's not inexpensive, Huel, but a big bag, I think, is supposed to last you a month or something. So
we'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much. Right, yeah, that's a great idea, and I can put a link to that in the show notes if anybody is interested in looking into that. So yeah, I mean, this kind of brings me on to my next question, which you've sort of started answering already, which is great, which was about supporting people who are living with this, because again, I've not experienced it, and I don't think I realized quite how debilitating it could be to somebody.
Yeah.
What sort of difficulties is somebody looking at sort of day to day if they have experienced this loss?
I think that the danger, especially for researchers and doctors and people who are looking at this from the outside, is that they think to themselves, yeah, okay, smell loss. So they're not going to be getting very much out of their food. And maybe, this is making them feel unhappy. The reality of that is much, much different. I think that it is kind of existentially destabilizing to lose your sense of smell. Our sense of smell is completely bound up with our sense of self. And when you don't have a sense of smell, it's like you're looking in the mirror and there's no reflection there. We're constantly feeding back to ourselves with our own smell. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean that in a kind of body odor way, but you are also a comforting presence to you. And there's been some really interesting research done on what they called auto smelling. And that's like smelling yourself, smelling your laundry. Do you smell your children's laundry? Do you, things that are slightly embarrassing to admit, but things that we all do. So without that, it's very destabilizing. And I always think to myself that by the time, and of course, with long COVID, we're looking at a whole range of symptoms, and we only talk about the sort of rhinology aspect of it. But let's just take that. Let's just take the word rhinology right there. Rhinologists who people who have lost their sense of smell think they want to see, they can look inside your nose. And when they do that, after it's been a couple of months, they'll say, looks fine to me, go home. There's nothing I can do for you. And by the time the patient has made their way to that rhinologist or ENT surgeon, the problems of smell loss have just drifted into all parts of their life, oozed into all the other parts of their life. So that will mean that, with a disrupted eating problem, you are missing out on the social interaction of being with your family. And let's just imagine getting dinner on the table. If you're the person in your family who is responsible for the cooking, the shopping, and all that kind of thing, you've got everything from meal planning, going to the grocery store, preparing the food, putting it on the table, washing up. There's a whole trajectory of experiences that go along with that expose you to smell, except maybe with the menu planning part, which you might do in front of your laptop. But all those experiences then become very, very distressing. And so frequently, and we recommend this, if it's that bad for you, you need to remove yourself from that equation entirely and leave the cooking to someone else, because it's just too awful. I mean, when it's extreme, people vomit when they're exposed to certain foods. So that disruption in a family environment is very, very distressing. People can't deal with their children. They can't feed babies. They find that so disgusting. So there's that aspect of it. There's the fact that you put your arms around your partner and they smell disgusting to you. That is very, very disruptive. You lose access to imagine all the things that you do to soothe yourself when something goes wrong. So it's a cup of tea or a bubble bath or a scented candle, whatever it is. I can guarantee you that if you want to make yourself feel better, it will almost always involve some sort of olfactory experience. And that too is gone. So you're feeling bereft, you're feeling stressed, you're feeling terribly, terribly anxious. I mean, that's what I see. I see an anxiety problem enveloping the whole thing, and then no way to help yourself. So recognizing that, we offer peer support because people need to get that out and swap that story with other people who can agree with them and provide affirmation for what they're going through.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've noticed throughout this whole experience of long COVID how important peer support is, especially when you're not really getting a lot of help from specialists, maybe because they don't understand, or maybe because there's been a lot of gaslighting going on for some people, and to not get that support from the place that you're supposed to get it from. That's where the peer support and all the support groups and things have really come into their own, I think.
Yeah. Certainly with COVID, over and over, we see people say, I waited 6 months for this appointment to see an ENT, and he looked in my nose and he said, there's nothing wrong and I should go home. Well, there is something wrong, but it can't be solved by an ENT. Rhinology is not where the short-term help is going to come for these patients. Yes, of course, there's masses of research going on. There's all kinds of publications are coming out just by the day, more and more coming out. So we are grateful to those researchers and clinicians who are working on that side. For the ENT who's, is not keeping up with the latest in olfactory loss from COVID, the response will be, there's really nothing we can do to help you. And then so often they'll say, if you haven't had any recovery in a year, you're going to have to live with it. You're just going to have to take up new hobbies.
Ouch.
And that's well-meaning, but it's unfortunately shows lack of understanding for what's actually going on inside the mind of that person. So at AbScent, we talk about 5 pillars of support for people who've lost their sense of smell. So they include peer support, which we've just been talking about, and that's through forums or sometimes in-person gatherings. Clinical support, so that's support from your doctor or your ENT, which hopefully you can get, but might not have been very helpful. Support with food, support with managing this new relationship with food and this altered eating experience. Then we have practical advice, which is things like helping people understand more about smell training and why it's good for them, and the many, many misconceptions that there are about smell training. And then finally, mental health support. And of course, clinical support and mental health support, that's nothing to do with us. That has to be had outside of AbScent. But we always talking about the importance of mental health support for people who really feel that they are struggling. And there are many of them who also tell themselves, why am I so bothered about this? It's just my sense of smell. But then equally, there are all kinds of people who will join in that conversation and say, no, it's normal to feel that way, and you should get support with mental health. I do hope that in time, the mental health community will kind of take more of an interest in this because it's important.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, if you lost your eyesight, then you'd be straight off to the doctor and they'd be doing all sorts of things to help, wouldn't they? Or to try and help. Whereas somehow if you say, oh, I can't smell, it's somehow not seen as important.
Yeah.
Which, I think is wrong. So you just mentioned your 5 pillars, and like I say, they're all incredibly important. Something that I find quite interesting is smell training, because I want to know a little bit more about what this is.
So smell training is, I always call it a supportive technique because it's not a cure. It is something that will hasten recovery. Now, there have been a lot of studies on it, and these studies in all kinds of settings. So with young people, old people, people who have had different kinds of smell loss. And in these studies, the people who undergo smell training for a couple of months, one study's looked at longer term, like 6 months or even 9 months, those people perform better with their objective olfactory tests. So you can give a test, I can give you a test, and then I can say your sense of smell scores this high out of 48. So they give these objective tests both before they begin the study and then at the end of the study. And then they compare the results of the people who smell trained against the people who have not smell trained. Because we do know that there is natural recovery will happen to a greater or lesser extent. And that's measured by the people in the control group. But people who add smell training onto their natural recovery, they do perform better. And in some cases, quite strikingly better. So that's the reason to smell train. I think that there are lots of ways that people misunderstand it. And every time I see misunderstanding of smell training in a discussion, I think that is a shame, because people who could benefit from it will be turned off from it. So someone might come into the group and say, it's been 18 months for me and I'm going to leave the group now because I'm better. And I just want you to know I didn't do anything special, and I didn't do smell training because that didn't work for me. But, in time I was fine. And I think to myself, that's a bit of a shame, because now everyone will read that and think, well, what's the point? But I do think there are so many benefits to smell training, and people misunderstand what it is, and therefore they don't do it, or they don't do it as often as they should have. So compliance is the biggest problem, I think, that there is. People might do it once or twice and then they just give up. What you're trying to do with smell training is to establish a habit of interrogating everything in your environment for smell. And for people who lose their sense of smell, they very quickly give up that impulse and they just turn away from it. And what we want to do is keep that impulse going, so that you smell your coffee before you drink it, or that you think about what it smells like when you go outside. And ambient smells, by the way, are something that comes back at the end because they're quite dispersed and they're not very strong. But it's always important to keep looking. And I think the important thing to remember is that smell training is not about an odor object in your nostril. That's not where the work is happening. The work is happening up here. When you think about the smell, look for the smell, try and recall any recollections that you might have that are related to the thing that you're trying to smell. And those activities can also send messages into the olfactory bulb from the top down. What we do know is that people who lose their sense of smell show a reduction in olfactory bulb volume. And olfactory bulb volume is strongly correlated with depression. So once messages stop going into the olfactory bulb and the olfactory bulb begins to lose its volume, very quickly depression sets in. Doesn't set in immediately. What sets in immediately is the anxiety. And then you get this gradual kind of dulling down. The world seems more and more colorless. So that response, that brain response to a reduction in the signals that are sent to the olfactory bulb can be counteracted by thinking about smells. And I think a lot of people just have difficulty accepting that or making that seem real to themselves.
That's really, really interesting. And that is something that people can just do at home themselves, is it?
Yeah. So we've got full instructions on our website. We've got a number of really good YouTube videos where I discuss smell training with some people who are leaders in the field. So you can find all of that on our YouTube channel. And then if you go into the YouTube channel and then just look for smell training, you'll come up with a video list.
Great. I'll drop a link to that in the show notes as well, because that sounds like something that a lot of people might find really useful. So, I mean, certainly what I wanted right at the start was something that I could do that would help. And I really struggled to find anything because I was a guinea pig. I was a first waver. But I think, what a lot of people want is something that they can do that's practical. So, the smell training is an obvious one now. You've talked about it. Is there anything else that people who are sort of struggling with the smell and taste can do practically day to day that might help, I guess, either to regain it or to cope with the loss of it, I guess?
So there are a couple of things that can be done to encourage people to eat more. I mean, these recommendations are really more in the realm of food, but things like going for a good true taste balance when you prepare a meal. So you might combine sweet and sour, or sweet and salty, for instance. If you made a salad, you might add some nuts into it for like a difference in texture, or combine temperatures, so something warm served with something cool. So those things are really important. The visual aspect of food is also really important. I think nothing is more dispiriting than white food on a white plate. So, and a lot of people eat plain boiled rice or plain boiled pasta with cheese. That seems to be a go-to food for a lot of people with smell loss. But all of that on a white plate does look kind of unappetizing. So anything that you can do to make it look more attractive is really important. So those are some things that I can think of. Adding trigeminal hints to the food. So chilies, for instance, ginger, mint, things like that can also add in. And all those foods, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, stimulate a third nerve called the trigeminal nerve. So that's it adds an extra dimension to the food.
Cool. That's really, really helpful. Can this affect children as well? I mean, a lot of the long COVID kind of dialogue is around adults, and children seem to get a bit forgotten because, the narrative was that they would be fine. And obviously we know that they're not. But is this similar? Does that affect them too?
Yes, we've got a lot of children. AbScent also runs a Facebook group for COVID kids. And in our private network, we also have that as a topic that people can follow. What happens with children is that they don't necessarily report loss of smell because they can't articulate that. But what will happen is that they'll go off their food. And I think the thing that parents need to look out for is a child that refuses its favorite food. And when that happens, that there is a parosmia problem. I don't think I've seen persistent smell loss in children beyond maybe 6 months, something like that. So that's good. And of course that's logical because children have a great capacity to regenerate. And don't forget that the olfactory system is regenerative. It is unique in the body in that it is constant. It's got stem cells in it. It's constantly producing new ones. It looks like COVID might be impeding the regeneration of new cells, but our sense of smell is designed that way. And so in young children, you might expect that it would definitely improve in time.
Right. Is that why, like, when you're a child, you might not like certain foods, and then as you grow up and become an adult, that you do start sort of eating things that you didn't as a child?
Yeah. There are a lot of foods that you develop a taste for as an adult. Things like coffee or beer or, chili as examples. Then there are other ones that have challenging textures like oysters or liver or, things like that. What we do know for sure is that as we age, we develop a taste for more bitter foods, which is why orange marmalade is preferred by the older demographic, and young children are always like, bah, how can you eat that? So I think that is something that has to do with aging of the taste and smell system. And of course, with aging, a bit like vision, we're all losing our sense of smell with age. So your sense of smell will start to drop off when you need reading glasses. So that's something else to bear in mind. And going back to what we spoke about earlier, it looks like smell training might stabilize a sense of smell in an older person.
Wow.
I think I'd like to end by giving a message of hope to anyone who's lost their sense of smell and has long COVID. So many doctors will say after 1 year, there's no hope, but we know that's not the case. We are still hearing about people who have started to experience recovery after 2 years and 6 months. So I think we should keep an open mind on that. It looks like the virus works in weird ways, as I just mentioned, to impede the development or the hatching, if you like, of new neurons. So people should just stay calm and stay focused and continue smell training and continue to go back into patient support groups if that helps them. And I really think they probably do. So, I want to wish everyone a good recovery and a speedy recovery. And until then, lots of help in support groups.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you've given loads of really helpful tips today as well. So everything you've mentioned, I'll pop into the show notes. So if anyone's looking for any of those links you've mentioned. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and I've certainly learned a lot. So I hope that everybody listening will as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and wishing everyone a speedy recovery.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.